She goes.
Okay, so as I was saying, there are 1,000 different books you could be reading, and as a one man or woman's book is another person's poison. I said that earlier. So I would say, these are two that I think are particularly up to date, where a lot of people's minds are at the moment. So I don't want to follow those chapter by chapter or in any way, that's just a background material like Josephus for what you may be doing in this class. So read one or the other of those two books through during the course of the term and draw from it whatever material you think will be helpful to you in writing whatever you write, whether on an exam or in a paper. Is that clear? So there's no specific assignments from those books. They're just books to read. Good books giving another opinion than my own and bringing you up to date. They've got pretty good bibliographies and things of that kind. Bringing you up to date with contemporary research, because I'm more interested in primary documents. And the literature in this field is so vast that I wouldn't even, from year to year, be able or even willing to stay on top of it. Because there's universities across America, from California to Atlanta, across Europe, all over the universe, with graduate students and faculty members all writing articles to get their promotions and to be able to go to conferences and flooding journals and trying to get published or perish and things like that. So the literature is so vast that it would be, you could actually turn into Rip Van Winkle by the time you finished it all. So I'm not saying you should or you shouldn't, but the point being, I don't have time in my life left to do all of that. You may be able to. So read one or the other of those if you can. The others are technical books that speak for themselves. Finally, the recommended ones. The complete Dead Sea Scrolls gives you all the Dead Sea Scrolls, the translation. I don't, as I told you, happen to like that person very, very much who edited it, but I've sold him more books than he deserves. And his translations are fairly precise, although the key words he tends to fob over, like as I told you on that already, acts, deeds instead of works. The anointed one instead of Messiah. Where he comes to a really crucial point for where Christian theology or thinking is concerned, he punts. And I think for the reader who is not aware of that, then they don't see the connections as easily as if he would use the precise translation. Where it says Messiah, he should say Messiah. He shouldn't say his anointed one. Because you think, well, maybe this isn't the Messiah, that they're talking about, when in fact it is. And occasionally he skips passages that don't fit in with his translation. But other than that, it's pretty good translation. The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception, as I told you about, is a very good one-volume introduction to the problem of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the questions and difficulties and the history of the research. And somewhat from, as I told you, I helped with that book to some extent, but I'm not responsible for the, what if, suppose, etc. type things. These are the two guys who wrote the Holy Blood, Holy Grail book. And I know them both personally. In fact, I just got a letter from the first one today, regretting that he did the lawsuit because it was very, very costly for him. And I wrote him back. I said, "Well, you got very poor legal advice because if the downside was such a downside, then it wasn't worth doing." And someone didn't give me the proper legal advice. I have no confidence in lawyers anyway, so who am I to say anything to anybody? I've never met a lawyer that didn't give me bad advice, or at least in retrospect, bad advice. I suppose because one always loses cases, it seems, and therefore one blames the lawyer. Maybe the lawyer gave me good advice, but one always ends up hating one's lawyer. In fact, I've always ended up hating my lawyer more than the person I was fighting. So someone may have had a good lawyer sometime. really be happy to hear that. Don't tell me now, but we'd love to hear a good lawyer story, because I've only had bad ones, and bad judge stories too. So again, it goes into my bad dean, bad president stories and so on. My advice to anyone is stay out of court as much as you can, because the winner in the court always seems to be the establishment figure. And 80–90% of the time the judge goes with the establishment, whether it's the policeman or whoever it is stopped you for a traffic ticket or whatever. The policeman can be lying through his teeth, and often is, and has done in my case, but you're going to lose. And that's just the way it is. Most of these judges are put into power by some election process or cronyism, and they have to repay whoever it is has put them there. It's a pretty ugly setup. It's not my idea of real justice, but maybe better than getting your head lopped off somewhere. So again, you know, there are, as I said, lesser and greater evils, I think. So you can't really say. So in any event, those guys are pretty well known, and I had to really rein them in a bit. You know, there were about 450 mistakes in their book, which I had to correct. But other than that, it's pretty solid, because 450 mistakes were actually correct. And so they had an actual solid book there. I did not like the title, and I told their publishers I didn't like the title. If there's been a deception of some kind, that's for the reader to decide at the conclusion, not for someone to beat them over your head with. But the thing about publishers is that they choose the titles often, not the writers. You'd be surprised. Mostly in popular type book markets, the publisher chooses the title. And the publisher chooses the title for it to sell, like my New Testament Code. They want a title like that. I mean, I would like the subtitle, The Cup of the Lord, The Damascus Covenant, and the Blood of Christ. But anyone knows that if someone saw that book, they'd say, what's this, you know? And if it just said the Cup of the Lord and the Blood of Christ, it might have sold, but that would have been a deception, because the book is not totally about the Cup of the Lord and the Blood of Christ. It's got the Damascus Covenant mixed in the middle of it. So the point is, I would have liked the subtitle. The publishers wanted something like the other thing, and so that's what often happens. So I had told them that they should do the Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered for the title, and let, if there's a deception or something that isn't totally on the up and up involved in what occurred in the Dead Sea Scrolls research issue, that the reader should make that as a conclusion. The publisher never spoke to me again, because I dared to question his, he had chosen that title for them. Never spoke to me again. I went into his SHI list, and I was persona non grata just for raising this little point. I then used the title for my next book, which I wrote, as you may or may not know, with Michael Weiss, another unfortunate experience. I was accused of doing things because he had ripped off other people's manuscripts without my even realizing it. But anyway, it doesn't make any difference now. The point being is that was unfortunate. But I had let him translate some of the documents that I had gotten a hold of, but I didn't know that he was using some other folks' versions to check his work with. He never bothered apprising me of that. That sounds like you know, after the fact, mealy-mouthed apology, but it happens to be the fact. And I had told him, do not use anyone else's work. And he had students working on it at the University of Chicago, who then promptly went and looked at other people's work. So all that is water way under the dam. But the Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered, I thought, was a good title. It wasn't too, you know, in your face, if you like. So he didn't use it, so I used it for my own book. Robert Eisler, The Messiah, Jesus, and John the Baptist. That was written in the 1920s. I think we have, I put a Xerox copy of it in the library someplace, because the original copy disappeared, I think. I had it Xeroxed and put it in the library at some point way back. I don't know where it disappeared to. But that is for his time and place, so much original research went into that book, even though it's not necessarily widely respected among conventional scholars. He wrote that before the scrolls were discovered. He went into concentration camps in the Second World War. He came out in 1947, his health broken, and he died around the time the scrolls were found. But if he had had the scrolls to work with, he could have gone as far further than I have gone, easily. This fellow was pretty much of a genius. What he tried to do was to reconstruct the original testimonies about Jesus and John the Baptist in Josephus' work, not the overwritten, that's where I get all my ideas about overwriting from him, not the overwritten, reworked version that presently exists in Josephus. And so by going back and examining the contemporary sources and so on and doing an incredibly good job at that, I don't think his reconstruction necessarily is convincing, but the process that he went through to me was really an impressive process. And the knowledge that he had and the wide-rangingness of where he went was really an impressive thing. So he was working on the testimonies in Josephus and then went back to see if he could figure out what Jesus had really said. The John the Baptist testimony, I think, is pretty authentic, but the Jesus testimony has been transformed by later copyists. Everyone agrees with that. It's what's called what's the word they use? An interpolation. What's called an interpolation. So that really is not reliable or authentic, but he felt there was something said at that point. I'm not sure that there was or there wasn't. But something has been written in that wasn't there in the original Josephus, and he assumes that the reference would have been negative in the original Josephus because Josephus didn't like the people he refers to repeatedly as miracle workers, pseudo-prophets. Josephus would never acknowledge anyone as being a real prophet. Pseudo-prophets, imposters, and particularly in the period from the 40s to the 60s before the war against Rome, his complaints against these people mount to crescendo. He's so aggressively against them. And he says that these innovators into the religion of the ancestors were more harmful even than the bandit. Bandit is another word for violent revolutionaries. The bandit thugs with whom they cooperated. And what they were trying to do, according to him, in two separate testimonies, one in the war and one in the Antiquities, I could find it for you, I've got it marked in my back, but I don't really want to scrabble through the books and look for them at the moment. But what they were trying to do, he said, is lead the people out into the wilderness, there to show them the signs of their impending freedom in one case, he says, in the other book he says redemption. So these miracle workers and imposters and pseudo-prophets who were in effect more dangerous even than the people he calls the bandits and the party insurgent people, were trying to lead the people out into the wilderness and show them the signs. Well, that's how Jesus is portrayed in the Gospels. Jesus is certainly portrayed, whether he was or wasn't, I don't know. But this is what we're doing, the historical Jesus. Jesus is certainly portrayed as someone who what? Goes out into the wilderness with the 5,000 or the 4,000 and shows the signs. But according to the Gospels, what are the signs? And even the Gospel of John constantly goes on about the signs Jesus is doing. For instance, and these are the signs which the Lord did in Cana of Galilee. The Gospel of John says several times. And at one point he says turning water into wine. In John, I think at the marriage, we'll look at those passages. But in the synoptic, we all know the difference now between synoptic and John, synoptic, based on the same source. But it isn't so clear-cut as this. The three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are largely synoptic, but they sometimes overlap with John as opposed to the other two, which is really weird, particularly Mark, but even sometimes Luke. So it's a very complicated process. For a long time, several decades back, people were trying to determine which gospel came first. And most of the scholarly works are dominated by, attempts and questions and analyses of that kind. And then there was form criticism and redaction criticism. This is all part of the New Testament vast literature underpinning that we have in the academic world. So there were all these attempts to reconstruct what was a reliable tradition, what wasn't a reliable tradition on the basis of these kinds of approaches. And I'm not an expert on these approaches, frankly. Other people can tell you about them, form, redaction, criticism, and so on. But one of the things that was very much to the fore was to try to determine which gospel was first, Mark or Matthew. The traditional view is that Mark is first, and then a lot of, particularly up in Claremont, they got all involved in this thing called Q. Q, which is a German sort of postulated idea for the, I think it's for the word Quellen, which means source. I don't even know what language it's in. Is it German, Latin, Greek? I'm not even sure. Maybe one of you guys can tell me. Maybe all three. But in any case, Q meant the source. So it was the extra material in Matthew that didn't exist in Mark. The extra material, I guess, in Matthew and Luke that didn't exist in Mark was called Q. As if all this could be, developed into some final format for how the Gospels were put together and developed. My view is that the interrelationships between the Gospels are far more complicated than that. They seem to bounce back and forth with different overlays. It's not sure at what point they even reach the final form that we have them. So I just don't think that those kind of determinations are can be the final determination. And I frankly give up, throw my hands up in failure, if you want, or dismay, or inability to make such a determination, because I think that the relationships are too complicated, and there's no way to tell which came first, which came second, which came third, or vice versa. And as I think I'll show you, I can show you through given words that the relationships are very odd indeed. And as I said, we don't even know when they reached the form we have them. John is supposedly, there's some copy of John, I think, found either in scrap piles in Egypt or in Sinai or someplace that's supposed to date from around 120. That could be. But if you look at a person called Justin Martyr, an early Christian theologian from the 2nd century, who was, according to his name, Martyr. He's mid-100s someplace, and he's from Asia Minor someplace. Justin Martyr, he writes a thing called, I think it's Dialogue with Trypho, I think it is. Anyway, he's attacking this Jewish rabbi figure that he has met in Asia Minor, and they're arguing over different things. He doesn't have the Gospels in the form we have them, and this is the mid 2nd century, and he's a theologian. He has something called the Memoirs of the Apostles, he calls it. He calls it the Memoirs of the Apostles. It's a single document called the Memoirs of the Apostles. But it's not the Gospels. It has some of the things in it, of course, that we're familiar with, but it doesn't have any actual structure of the form that we're familiar with. So how come in the mid-100s does someone who's supposed to be you know, in the forefront of Christian theology, how come he doesn't know the Gospels that we have? And I don't even think he shows any indication of knowing John at all. I'm not saying that doesn't say that John wasn't floating around somewhere, but he doesn't seem to know it, and he doesn't even know the Gospels. He doesn't call them Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So that, to me, is the earliest testimony that I can find of anyone talking about the Gospels who should know something about them and doesn't. You follow what I'm trying to say? So he doesn't call them Gospels. He has passages from our Gospels. You can check which ones he has, which ones he does not, by any means all, and they're not in different Gospels. They're not differentiated. And he doesn't call them, you know, the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel. He calls them the Memoirs of the Apostles. That's all he calls them. And as I said, it's very sketchy and very incomplete, and it doesn't agree totally with what we have. I would recommend, if you're really interested in this question, look at, most people don't look at it, look at Justin Martyr first and read his writing. It's very, very boring, but read his writing and then catalog what he's got there, and I think you're well on your way to a first step of what was circulating around the year 150. You know, and then go from there. Say, well, then when were the Gospels that we know put in their final form? I have no idea. But certainly, it wasn't even at the Council of Nicaea in 325. They were just debating these things. I think it was not till the end of the 300s that the final form of what we now know as the four Gospels were in their form. That doesn't mean they weren't circulating earlier in different forms, but there's also lots of apocryphal Gospels circulating earlier. As we know, you know, the Gospel of Judas was circulating quite early, in the 200s anyway. Late 100s anyway, because Irenaeus in Lyon in France condemns it. so it was circulating, and maybe because Irenaeus in Lyon in France condemns it, is one of the reasons it disappeared. Who knows? I have no idea how and why these things circulated and developed and so on. But certainly different things were circulating in the East and in the West. Certain different, and look at a scholar like Irenaeus in France, what we now call France Gaul. I can assure you he knew nothing about Jesus Christ. Nothing whatever. Except some imaginary figure in his mind. I mean, he knew nothing about the historical Jesus at all. He just condemned and accepted what he found attractive and unattractive. It wasn't something that was based on any historical perception. He was a very, aggressive personality, as many of the early church fathers were. The Eastern ones are less aggressive. The Western ones. Eusebius came from the East, but he went west with Constantine, and he's, as I said, is particularly aggressive. He organized the Council of Nicaea for Constantine. He basically brought Constantine into the church. He was Eastern, though, in the sense he came from Palestine. Caesarea, but he was a Greek background from Caesarea, and he was very bigoted person. He had, as I said, no love or charity in him whatsoever. I'm not trying to undermine anything about the charity doctrine. I'm just trying to state a fact. So if you are recommending and advocating charity and peacefulness and so on, then it seems to me you should be somewhat of a charitable individual yourself. Someone asked me at the break last time, where did these ideas of turn the other cheek and love your enemy and so on come from? Who asked me that question? You did. Which bears on what we're talking about, and it is in my mind vis-a-vis people like Eusebius, and that's probably where it started to come into your mind. You see, I think he was asking me, how did Jesus get these unique ideas? Or something to that effect. Now, we all know that some of these ideas are what are associated with, quote, Jesus. You see, I know I have perhaps not terribly attractive presentation in that regard, but these are not new ideas. They're only new in Palestine. These are not new ideas in the Greco-Roman sphere at large. That's what makes me suspect the historical presentation of the Jesus in Palestine. We're talking about a figure, call him Jesus, which oddly enough in Hebrew is supposed to come from the word Joshua or Yehoshua or Yeshua, which actually means what in Hebrew? Savior. Yehoshua is he who saves his people, the Savior. So his name, transliterated into Greek from Hebrew, this is a short name. Yeshua was shortening from Yehoshua, as you can see. Basically, this syllable went out. And J's are Y's in Hebrew, by the way. Latin J's are Y's in Hebrew. So what do you mean? Well, the consonant in Hebrew is Yud. There's no J consonant in Hebrew. So it's a Yud. It's a Yud that goes into Greek, and then Latin has, I think Greek, it still keeps the Y form. For instance, Jacob, I think in Greek is still Yaakov, I think so. It only becomes Jacob as it goes into Latin and other Western European languages. Am I making myself clear there? Okay, so you should try to know a little Hebrew if you can sometimes. And this consonant here is Yud. And it's usually found at the beginning of words like this, and it usually has to mean something like he who, he who. That's why you get so many of them. Yehoshua, what can I think of some other ones? Yehochanan, Yochanan, John. Yochanan is he who comforts. Give me another one beginning with J, and I'll tell you what it means. Think of any names beginning with J in Hebrew transliteration? Well, don't give me Jeremiah, because that doesn't follow that particular route. I don't think. No, what? No, Jerome comes from Jeremiah. What? Yeah, Yehuda, Judas. That doesn't work that way because it depends if it's part of the verb or added to the verb. In the case of John and Jesus, it's a he added to the verbal root. In those cases, Yehuda, Judas, it's more part of the actual root of the word. You know, it's very complicated. So it's not part of the grammar. It's not a suffix or a prefix. In this case, a prefix. It's actually part of, because it can be part of the root. There are, words that have it in the root, but it's also part of the grammatical. Like we have H as a he, but we also have H in words like a hero, that have nothing to do with he. Follow me? Anyway, I can't think of, if one comes to me like that, I will, oh, Yehonatan, Jonathan, Yehonatan. In that case, it's for God. Yeho is God. So in that case, it's God gives. Because Yeho can also be God, Yahweh, Jehovah, added to the words. The reason Jeremiah is difficult is because there the God is at the end of the word, not at the beginning of the word. Jeremiah in Hebrew is, do you know what it is in Hebrew? Yeremiyahu. The Yahoo is God added at the end of the syllable, like same with Isaiah, Ishiyahu. You have to know what Ishi means. I have to look it up. I'm not sure what Ishi means in Hebrew. But Yahoo is, God added at the end of the word. That's why all those later prophets have those funny endings on their word, on their names. Jeremiah, Zechariah. Who? Zedekiah, right. All those are Yahoo names, meaning they're, Yahweh's names from the, the name, getting a feel here, but it doesn't hurt. And all knowledge is useful. You know, the Hebrew official name for God is YHWH. You all know that? Anyone doesn't know that in this class? Okay, you're all advanced students. And then, so they tried to fill that in modern-wise, and they get Yahweh. Because as Hebrew is and that's another one of those he forms, by the way. There it is, right there. It's because this is a root in Hebrew. And Hebrew is based on three-letter roots. So are all Semitic languages, Arabic too. You take SLM, it's on an airline. What's it mean, SLM, in Hebrew and Arabic? Huh? Shalom, salam, peace. Islam is built off of that. Islam has SLM in it. And the I is a prefix, the A is another vowel added in a different form to show you it's a verbal noun. I don't want to overdo it, but it's a fourth form verbal noun meaning to cause to make peace or to cause to surrender. And Islam means surrender. Surrender. They want us to surrender, actually. Surrender to God's will, normally speaking, not to the Muslims, but it can be interpreted to the Muslims too, because that's God's will. But the actual name, Islam, means to cause to make peace, that is, to cause to surrender. And so there's a very good indication where the Y is part of the verbal form. Am I making any sense there? Now in Hebrew, Yehovah, which is a total misnomer, based on the three-letter root and the he form. If you've read the Old Testament, do you remember what Moses said to God when he met him at the burning bush, or God said to Moses? He said, I am the Lord, or something like that, etc. Well, if you look at the Hebrew, he says, my name is Ahweh. Not Yahweh, but Ahweh. I am who am. I am who am. Or, if you prefer, see, that's Ah is first person. Yah is third person. That's just Hebrew grammar. So it can change. When God is speaking, it's Ahweh, showing you it is a verb. A verbal noun, actually. When you're speaking about him, it's Yahweh. Or Yahweh, or whatever. The point is that Ahweh means HWH again. It actually means, again, a fourth form causative, because we don't have the causative form in English as they have in Arabic and Hebrew. To me, I mean, it's clear to me, it means he who causes to be. Because HWH means to be, and the form of the word means to cause to be. So he's the creator. It's just their way of saying the creator. I know it sounds weird, but that's all it is. The creator of being. He who creates, he who causes to be. And you see, this got all mixed up in when the Bible was translated into English, the time of the Elizabethan period and so on. The scholars, see, the Hebrews knew that they didn't pronounce that word. Why? It was the forbidden name of God. Only the high priest pronounced the word when. The festival coming up this month, what? Once a year, when?
Yom Kippur.
Yom Kippur. And what did the high priest do on Yom Kippur? What is Yom Kippur? Tell everybody what Yom Kippur is. Day of Atonement. When the high priest went into the inner sanctum of the temple, that was empty. And I guess there was a judgment seat or something that was either there or supposed to be there. Well, anyway, he knelt before the judgment seat and he asked forgiveness from God on behalf of the whole people. I think, look, it doesn't mean that everyone was running around sinning all year long and then the priest was going in there to ask for everyone forgiveness of sins the way we interpret it now. You know, I think people were supposed to go up and, you know, atone for their own sins, generally speaking, give a chicken or some animal of some kind, a dove or whatever, or some grain or some, I don't know, some mush. I don't know what they gave that they would give for various.
Like the best.
Yeah, the more rich you were, then you bring up I guess you bring up a steer or a ram or something really impressive. But the poorer you were, I suppose you could get away with a pigeon or Anyway, what was this for? Well, the priests got all that. That was their wages basically. They took all that home. That's the old ancient system. I mean, they didn't have a good taxation system that they could keep things going. You know, they had to get their sustenance and stuff. Only the Holocaust, the stuff that was actually totally burnt, was not, totally immolated. That was special sacrifice. I'm not a great sacrifice ceremony knowledgeable person, but I know that much. So anyway, what I'm trying to say here, how we got off of this tangent, I do not know. But the point is that, how did we get off on sacrifice? It must have been related to what. Oh yes, thank you very much. Yom Kippur. You got me back. Saw myself off a limb and off my joke back. Yeah, Yom Kippur, when the high priest went into the temple and pronounced the forbidden name of God. Now, he must have known how to pronounce it, otherwise he couldn't have pronounced it. Like Moses, in imitation of Moses in the tent of meeting in the desert. Otherwise it was forbidden on pain of death to pronounce the name of God. So when the Protestant translators of the 16th, 1700s started to translate into the common languages, German, English, and so on, because they didn't want to depend on the Latin version of things anymore, or the papal version of things. They went to the Hebrew Bible and they looked at it, and they didn't realize that by that time the Jews had put diacritical markings in the Bible. You know what diacritical markings are? Here's the way the word appears in the Bible, just consonants. So they put, this isn't actually what they put, but they put little dots and dashes and things under the words to tell them how to pronounce that word, that were developed not way back then, but around the 10th century AD, or maybe a little earlier, maybe the 8th century AD. These diacritical marks were put in much, much later to help people who had forgotten how to pronounce words, pronounce the words. And they don't always necessarily were correct, I don't think. For instance, you know the Hebrew king called Solomon? In the way they put the diacritical marks in, he became known in Hebrew as Shlomo. Now look, I don't ever think there was a Hebrew king called Shlomo, frankly. I really don't think there was. But that's how their diacritical, or Samuel became Shmuel. No, I do not think so. I don't accept, maybe it's just my American ear. The reason I don't accept it is because in the old Greek translations we do get Samuel. And we do get Solomon. You know, those are very old translations from the 2nd and 3rd century BC. And so they must have had some era how these names sounded, and I don't think the rabbis of the 10th century knew what they were doing, in all cases. When they came up with names like Shlomo and Shmuel and some of those shlo sounds, you know, maybe, maybe not. They're just too, I don't think a king would have his name be so difficult to pronounce. That's just my own orneriness. Don't have to follow what I think. But the point is that the Protestant translators, the one thing was clear. What the Jews put under here were diacritical marks not for the word Yahweh, since they knew they weren't to say Yahweh. They put the diacritical marks for the word Adonai. What does Adonai mean? My Lord. So they took these vowels, E, O, A, and stuck them under these things here, and you come out with Yehovah. When the Protestant translators saw it, which was, you know, Jehovah. But it's nice sounding in English, but it just isn't Hebrew, and it isn't what they were saying. And it's actually, they didn't realize that the Jews just said Adonai, which means my Lord. And they put those markings in under there so that they would remind themselves not to pronounce the word, but to say Adonai. So there's a mistake that crept into the English lexicon. I don't think Yahweh is any better. I don't know how they pronounced it. Maybe Yahoo, I'm not sure. That's why the Yahoo website always attracted me, because it was often Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu. I think Yahoo may have been how they pronounced the name of God, Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu. You know, Ishiah.